Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast. This week on the show, we are conducting a comprehensive review of the many different approaches to hunting mature bucks during the late season. And these are ideas that come from the many different experts that have shared with me their approaches over the course of the 17-year history of Wired to Hunt. All right, welcome back to the Wired to Hunt podcast, brought to you by First Light and their Camo for Conservation initiative. Today we are talking late season. We are breaking down the month of December and on into January as we enter this final phase of the whitetail year. We're doing another one of these deep dive, comprehensive reviews. We did it for October. We did it for November. The idea here is to kind of do, what some people would call a literature review, where we basically take a big picture look at the many different perspectives and approaches to a certain topic. In this case, it's hunting the late season for whitetails. I'm going to talk you through kind of a high-level overview of how many people think about this time of year, the most important things to remember about deer behavior, about how deer use the habitat, about how deer have now reacted to hunting pressure around them and everything else that kind of trickles down after that. Then we're going to talk through several of the most common approaches to hunting this time of year. And we are going to look at some excerpts from books, as well as excerpts from previous podcasts and videos we've filmed from different experts, getting their take on these things. So in addition to the summaries that I'm going to provide, we're also going to get some insight in the words of and from the minds of people like Jeff Sturgis, Don Higgins, Mark Drury, John Eberhart, Tony Peterson, and Hale Blood, I believe are the folks we're going to hear from today. So you're going to get a lot of different ideas here. You're going to come away from this conversation with a very clear understanding of what's to come here in December and January and what you can do as a deer hunter to make sure you have the very best chance possible to fill your tags, to have some success, and to have some fun. So that's the plan. Before we get into that, very briefly, if you are listening to this in real time when this episode's dropping, which would be Tuesday, November 27th, 2025, the MeatEater and First Light Black Friday sale is ongoing. This goes into, I think, December 1st, up to 40 or 50% off, all sorts of stuff. You know the deal. Tons of huge sales on everything. Relevant to you as a deer hunter, maybe four things worth noting. Number one, the major cold weather kits for whitetail hunting from First Light. The core, which is kind of our mid-season piece, the thing I'd recommend to most people for most whitetail locations. The core kit, and then the thermic kit. So again, this is a jacket and bib kit. The thermic is for like the total frigid Arctic, far, far north, cold, frigid, snowy stuff. Both of those are 40% off during this sale. So it's a very good deal if you're looking to really upgrade your outerwear. The furnace hoodie, which is what I'm wearing right now, an absolute favorite of mine all year round for just wearing around the house or being outside scouting, shed hunting, or wearing as an insulating mid-layer during a cold weather hunt. Very comfortable. Furnace hoodie, that's 20% off. And then I was just going to tell you that the Wired Hunt hat is on sale, but it's actually sold out. But the Wired Hunt t-shirt is still available, and that's 50% off, I believe. So check it all out over at the MeatEater store, or firstlight.com, or wherever it is that you want to take a look at our products. We've got the Phelps gear, FHF gear, Dave Smith decoys. They all have their own websites. You can check those out as well. So that's it as far as sales and promotions. On to late season deer hunting. Let's first talk through the defining characteristics of the late season, the core things to be thinking about when we reach this point of the year. A number of different things have happened that impact the lives of deer and the lives of hunters. So first, let's talk about kind of the situation that deer are in. Number one, once you've made it to the late season, once you've made it to December, there has been a ton of hunting pressure, right? These deer that we are chasing now have been pursued, bothered, shot at, and harassed by hunters for weeks and weeks and weeks. At a minimum, probably 2 months, if not 3 months in some cases. That colors everything in a whitetail's world. The daily movements, the natural tendencies, the patterns, their food desires, all of that stuff, all of that is kind of surpassed by the simple desire to survive and the simple desire to avoid danger, in our case, from humans. So every decision you make as a hunter has to think about that first and foremost. These deer have been pressured. How have they reacted? What are they going to do because of the fact they've been hunted for months on end? Now, of course, where you hunt, that could relate or could lead to different degrees of hunting pressure and different degrees of changes in behavior, right? So if you have a spot that you're hunting that's public land in a heavily pressured state like Pennsylvania, let's say, or Michigan, you're going to see a very different level of impact. You're going to see deer that react to that pressure dramatically, that have maybe relocated in dramatic ways, maybe have changed how much daylight activity they have in dramatic ways. This is also especially true if you have a gun season that's already opened up. If your gun season, like in Michigan, opened in mid-November, by the time December comes around, things are dramatically different. That said, if you hunt in Iowa or Kansas or some other state that has not had quite as much pressure, maybe your gun seasons have not yet fully opened up, maybe you hunt in a place that simply just doesn't have as many hunters, maybe you're on private ground, a large piece of private ground that you control and you've kept pressure really low, well, in that case, deer might still be doing the natural things they would normally want to do at this time of year. Maybe the hunting pressure impact will not be as significant, but you need to think about that. You need to consider what's the reality on the ground here for these deer, and is it all hunting pressure impacted, or are they in their natural standard behaviors as they would be otherwise? Now, because of the fact that the hunting season's been going on for a very long time, because of the fact that gun seasons maybe have been open by now, you're also going to have a reduction in available bucks to hunt. If you are trying to kill, let's say, for example, a mature buck, and the hunting season started in September or October, and let's say there was 10 of them in the couple square miles around where you hunt, by the time December rolls around, there's a good chance that a lot of those deer are just simply not alive anymore. I don't know what that's going to be. In Michigan, I would guess that, more than 50% of them are probably dead. Maybe more like 80% of them are dead. Maybe if you're in Iowa or Kansas or Illinois, maybe it's a lot less than that. But either way, you're simply, just by virtue of the fact that there's been a lot of hunting going on and gun pressure, especially in which the majority of deer get killed, you're just going to have fewer targets. And so you have to go into this phase of the season with those expectations, understanding that maybe I had 10 deer to hunt, or maybe I had 2 deer to hunt, now it's down to 1. Maybe I had 10, now it's down to 4. Go into it knowing that's the case. And what that means for you as a hunter means, like, not only do your expectations need to be adjusted a little bit, but then also you need to know that everything has to be a little bit sharper now. You could get away with some mistakes, or you could get away with just a general idea when there's 10 of these deer running around. But when there's only 1, or there's only 2, or whatever it is, you simply have to be that much more dialed, that much more attuned to what these deer are doing, why they're doing it, and how they're doing it. So attention to detail, it always matters, but it really matters in the late season. Now, let's talk a little bit more about how all of this, or kind of how some of the weather factors and behavior factors over recent weeks are going to impact deer behavior as well, because not only do you have all of this hunter pressure, not only do you have fewer deer on the landscape, but you also have deer that have been worn down and that are dealing with difficult conditions. So first off, the rut just happened, right? We just had these bucks go through an absolute marathon for weeks and weeks and weeks. The most physical exertion they will have the entire year just happened over the previous month or so. Most bucks will lose a dramatic amount of weight. They will, utilize a massive amount of their energy reserves, and they will be struggling now because of that. These are wore down deer. Physically, I guess I can't speak for them mentally, but in any way possible, these bucks are wore down. They are just beat down to a pulp. That's going to impact how they act in the coming weeks. And then finally, layer on top of that, they are also now going to be getting very difficult, increasingly difficult week after week weather conditions. So, of course, as we all know, temperatures are going down. Extreme winds and precipitation events like big snowstorms, blizzards, ice storms, all of that stuff's going to start happening more regularly. And so this is going to lead to bucks increasingly focusing on the very first thing I mentioned, which was survival. And that's really the moral of the story here. Survival is number one for these deer at this point. I mentioned earlier how hunting pressure impacts that in a big way. Deer are simply trying to find safe places, but then they are also simply trying to survive the difficulties they're enduring now, having just used up all of their energy, all of their extra fat, all of their resources. These deer are trying to get some food back on. They're trying to put the feed back on. They're trying to recover from this incredible physical exertion they just went through. And then they are also trying to survive the increasingly difficult elements. So because of that, a deer's life, let's talk about a mature buck's life. A buck's life now is going to revolve around a few things. Number one, it's going to revolve around trying to find the safest place, trying to find that sanctuary, trying to find that pocket of safety where they're not going to be impacted by hunters. All right. So that is a key thing for a buck. That will need to be a key thing for you as a hunter. Finding these safe spots, finding these core sanctuaries, finding these areas that bucks think they can survive. Secondly, they're going to be looking to survive the elements and survive this food issue that they've just been coming out of. Energy, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for here? Energy deficit. And that means they're going to be gravitating towards high quality winter food and high quality cover. In the case of winter food, that means like high carbohydrates. They are packing on energy, carbs. That's a big thing for deer right now. Then when it comes to cover, they're looking for high stem count, like thickness, stuff that makes them feel safe. And they are also looking for thermal cover, stuff that protects them from above, that can, shelter them from the wind, shelter them from rain and snow, something that will keep the heat down. That's going to be something they're going to like. While also at times, when the weather's not as bad, they're going to be looking for sun. So south-facing hillsides, that kind of thing might also attract deer. You can find the best case where there's like cedars or conifers and stuff scattered with little openings on the south-facing hillside and some grass and stuff. Wow, that's a dynamite spot for a buck to spend some time in the super late season. So think about that. Those are the types of places they are looking for, right? Those are the types of places they are going to gravitate towards. Now, the second or third thing to consider is the fact that once they find these places, they are reducing their movements dramatically because of those safety issues and because of those energy issues. Deer have been harassed. They want to reduce their exposure to danger as much as possible, which means they are probably going to be moving less than they had earlier in the year, right? They know that when they move in daylight over long distances, that exposes them to danger. So in many cases, by the time you get to the late season, that is reduced dramatically. And then I talked about the energy issue. Deer are trying to survive. They're trying to conserve energy. So they are going to be, again, moving less because every time they make a large movement, every time they travel a long ways from a bedding area to a feeding area, they're exerting energy. They are creating a deficit. So what deer would prefer to do is they want to find the best area of safety that has the best available thermal winter cover, that is closest to the best available winter food source where they can add energy, and they're going to move as little as possible between those two places, both to preserve their safety and to preserve their energy. That, in a nutshell, is what the late season deer activity is. That's what deer want to do. That's what deer are ideally going to be doing. That's what they're seeking out. They're trying to find a place where that can be their reality. So us as deer hunters, we need to go find those places. If we owned land and we were able to plan for this, we could try to create these scenarios. You can build this type of scenario. You can preserve some type of sanctuary. You can create or manage and foster quality late season thermal cover and quality late season food. And you can have these places that you leave alone so that when it gets to this time of the year, these deer can go in there and feel safe and spend their time and start moving in daylight and doing this bed to feed small movement and feel really comfortable and pack on the energy again and then slip there and hunt them. If you can build that, perfect. For many of us, we don't have the ability to build that. We don't have a big property where we can do this, and we simply have to try to find that situation. Search it out, whether it be on public land or private land by permission or a lease that we get to hunt. Whatever it is, you might just need to find the closest thing you can to that and then take advantage of it. But that is a really key thing to be thinking about this time of year is what deer are doing. So what are these key circumstances impacting them and what are deer doing because of it? Anytime you find yourself trying to decide where to hunt or why to hunt a spot or how to think through your plan, go back to these like core principles of the situation that deer are in right now, and then what they're trying to do to survive. They're trying to survive hunters, they're trying to pack on energy, and they're trying to conserve energy. They're trying to stay warm, they're trying to stay in cover, they're trying to build up those energy reserves again. That is a deer's life for the next 6, 7, 8, several months, 6, 7, 8 weeks, several months from now. This is what is going on a day-to-day basis for these deer. Now, don't just take my word for it. I want to read to you another person's take describing some of the same things, but with some additional details. This is Steve Bartilla, longtime whitetail writer and hunter, sharing here his kind of overview of the late season situation for deer and what that means for them and us. And this is from the book Advanced Stand Hunting Strategies, Real World Tactics for Today's Trophy Whitetails. In an effort to minimize the effects of all of these detrimental factors, deer of the upper Midwest, mountains and points farther north employ behavioral and physiological adaptations. To begin with, they significantly reduce their movement. Often they do little more than travel back and forth between bedding and feeding locations. The less they move, the less energy they burn. To take energy conservation a step further yet, they even slow their metabolism. Along with that, when the temperatures really plummet, the deer combat this by shifting their feeding activities more to the warmer late afternoon hours. Since the late night and early morning hours are typically the coldest portion of the day, this modification allows them to remain bedded, conserving body heat during these frigid periods. Next, they shift their now greatly reduced home range to locations that best promote their survival. In the areas that consistently receive deep snow cover and brutal temperatures, the destinations for these winter migrations are traditional yarding areas. Most often, a thick stand of mature evergreens, such as white cedar or spruce, is selected. Here, the dense canopy of branches creates a ceiling effect. Not only does this trap heat to keep the temperature at ground level a degree or two warmer, it also captures some of the snow, making travel easier. Furthermore, with so many deer packing into these areas, the extra hoof traffic also results in more easily traveled deer trails, in addition to providing more noses, eyes, and ears to detect predators. In conjunction with that, this is the period when those otherwise solitary bucks now gladly utilize the same bedding areas, trails, and food sources as the doe family groups. This intermingling allows them to take advantage of the heat retention properties of the yarding area and increase protection from predators, as well as the easier travel as mentioned. In this setting, the food sources are most often woody browse. White cedar is always preferred when available. It's the only woody browse known to be able to sustain a whitetail's life completely by itself. Areas of recent logging activity are typically the next best alternative. If the logging is conducted in early winter, the plethora of tops scattered across the ground provides a bounty of buds. Older activities can be good choices as well. Until the regrowth of saplings extend beyond the deer's reach, they also offer a concentration of tender buds. If none of those is available, it becomes a matter of finding whatever natural browse is available. As we drift into areas that typically provide warmer temperatures and less snow, a less traditional form of yarding occurs. Instead of concentrating on thermal cover, deer in these regions gravitate to the best available food sources. When they exist, standing crops such as corn, soybeans, and sorghum are almost always preferred. In areas where standing crops are in short supply, it's not uncommon for a lone field to draw deer from miles around. When snow depths allow, waste left from harvesting crops is also a good option. The same can hold true for hay fields that contain round bales of hay. When agricultural options aren't available, the same hierarchy of woody browse species polishes off the list of preferred food sources. Interestingly, in areas where yarding commonly occurs, mild winters often inspire deer to dismiss traditional yarding areas for prime food sources as well. However, regardless of how much better the food may be, they'll almost always choose the thermal protection when snowflakes and temperatures fall. All right. Now, for a kind of one more high-level take on this late season set of behaviors, I want to share with you a brief excerpt from a podcast I did with Mark Drury, in which he walked through the way that him and his brother Terry have broken down the phases of a deer's life. They do this on a very granular level. They've got 13 different phases they've broken the year into. But I want to play for you here just a quick minute or two of Mark walking through his late November all the way through January phases and what he and Terry have found deer tend to do in their experience. So let's listen to that real quick too.
I love like 1 to 4 o'clock during that particular phase. Then we get into green revisited the latter part of November 26th through December the 5th. Bucks, the really, really mature ones, are start coming back to the green fields looking for does because that's where they're going. And a lot of the bucks are starting back to those green fields because that's the period where you're having frost morning and night, and you're starting to break those green fields down. The palatability goes through the roof, and there's a lot of deer visiting those green fields. We've killed a lot of big bucks during that phase. December 6th through December the 8th, it's another little bit of a miniature lull. It's tough during this particular phase. We call it waiting on a front. If you catch a front, it kicks them into their late season feed patterns, and we have a really good period then. If you want the best overall movement in December 9th through the 21st, it's called feedback. Awesome. Good bucks out early. Make sure you're on your stand in the afternoon and make sure you're there early. Then December 22nd to January 15th, slowly but surely the daylight activity starts to slow down, and you again need a front. But that's when you get some of the most drastic weather of the winter. And if you get that, you can kill a big buck if you're on him. It's very similar to the first phase because it's all about food and they're not bedded very far from it.
Okay, so there's two different takes on how deer are reacting now to this new world they're living in, this late season world. Hunting pressure impacts, cold weather impacts, habitat changes, food source changes, all of that leads to different behaviors. One thing we haven't talked very much yet about, though, is rut activity in December or beyond. There's two different things here that are worth considering. One, if you hunt or live in the South, there could be full-blown, like the rut, the peak of the rut might be happening for you in December or January. There's some funky things in the South. There's been, relocations. There's many different factors that lead to the timing of the rut being different in different pockets of southern states. So I'm not going to get into the specifics there because I couldn't be like, well, if you live in northern Alabama, it's this thing. And if you're in southwestern Mississippi, it's this other thing. I would just tell you to make sure if you live in those southern states, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, some of these other regions, Texas, make sure you talk to other people in your location. I imagine most of you already know this, but just in case you don't, if you don't know when the timing of your rut is in the South, talk to buddies, talk to any mentors you might have, call the local DNR officer and ask them, when does this typically happen in my area? Is this happening sometime in December? Is this happening sometime in January? That is the case in some spots down there by you. If you fall into this bucket, and if that's the case, what you want to be doing is listening to the episode we did about November hunting, which was our rut episode, and use those tactics. Those are the tactics that will apply for you in December or January, if that's when your rut is. So, all that said, most of us do not fall into that category. Most of us had our majority of our rutting activity happening in November, but there is this thing that folks sometimes refer to as the second rut or the late rut or something like this. And the idea is that if there's somehow a doe that did not get bred the first time around in November, a month later, 30 days later, she could come into heat again. And if that happens, you could have rutting activity again, maybe in December or beyond. This is something that's pretty uncommon in many places, especially where there's buck-to-doe ratios that are very skewed. But what can happen more commonly is a doe fawn reaching sexual maturity, not in time for that first round in November, but by this early December time period where many deer are now coming into heat and they are large enough now to be at sexual maturity and so essentially coming into heat for the first time. I have found this to even happen in southern Michigan. I have seen doe fawns come into heat and there be a little miniature flurry of rutting activity on December 6th or 9th or 10th or 1st. That's all possible. I've seen this in southern Ohio too. I've heard people see this, just about anywhere in the whitetail range. So it's something that I don't plan my hunts around when it comes to December or January. I'm not going into it saying, all right, I'm going to do a second rut hunt. That's not typically what's going on, but I'm watching for it. So if I see something that looks like November activity, like one doe with 5 bucks chasing her, or 2 bucks sparring, or standing, or a bunch of satellite bucks all standing around one big buck and a doe, if I see that, that's like a light bulb moment that says, okay, I have a second rut kind of thing going on here. I need to focus on that little zone here right now and maybe apply some of those rutting tactics again, right? If you see this, now the calling techniques that you used in November might very well work again. Now the idea of hunting all day in that doe bedding area like you were doing during the rut, that might be worth doing here for a day or two in that zone. If you see a buck locked on a doe, hunting that buck on the doe just as you would have on November 15th, getting tight to where they are, making sure you're as close and in that small area that they're going to focus on for the next 48 hours, same thing applies. All that said, I want to share with you one more take on this second rut idea. Tom Ingerbo, a renowned hunter and outfitter from Wisconsin, wrote pretty extensively about this in his book, Growing and Hunting Quality Bucks. I'm going to read that for you. And there's a little bit here just in general when it comes to his late season approach as well, but a big part of this is discussing his second rut ideas. For bow hunting, late season action starts and stops with food. And in our region, deer find food in nearly every valley that held or holds agricultural crops. Whether those fields were harvested earlier in autumn or they still contain uncut standing crops, deer group up and find ways to scrounge up food. Does and their fawns join others from the doe's bloodline to form loose family groups, and they set up residence where terrain and brush provide shelter and easy access to nearby foods. Invariably, a doe that didn't get pregnant earlier will go into heat once more 28 days after she entered estrus in November. Between their need for food and the allure of these recycled does and female fawns entering estrus, bucks emerge from protected sites where they've remained secure since gun season. As these bucks approach early winter fields and study the bunched-up doe family groups, they feel some familiar urges and a rekindling of their aggressive tendencies. It's not uncommon for bucks to again spar and joust, but they've lost much of their competitive edge from a month before. It's more like patty cake and shadow boxing as their antlers click and clack at the wood's edge. Their testosterone levels have been dropping for the past few weeks, and although the urges to breed does and intimidate foes remain, the bucks are more mellow. Bow hunters shouldn't expect this so-called second rut to bring a repeat performance of November. Bucks won't roam the ridges all night or half-trot from field to field each morning in search of love. Neither will they storm down a field's edge with fire in their eyes intent on destroying a rival. But if that field contains corn or soybeans and a dozen does and fawns are feeding there late in the afternoon and one of them is an estrus, there's a good chance that bucks will soon arrive to check her out. Such situations are common in mid-December, which is why I think it's one of the best times of all to take a huge buck. In fact, I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say mid-December can even be a better time to hunt than November. Why? Again, it's that perfect storm scenario. Deer tend to be more bunched up in December, which makes it easier to predict where you might cross paths with a wall hanger. If most of the farm's female deer are congregated on a snow-dusted alfalfa field, the buck has a target-rich environment for locating a doe ready to breed. In December, only a small percentage of does come into heat, and a buck isn't inclined to traipse through the countryside for hours on low-odds missions. He's hungry and worn down, and testosterone isn't forcing him to ignore those physical discomforts. He's looking for a more convenient, efficient way to romance the doe, and a good food source provides those golden opportunities. In addition, unlike a mature doe that chases off her fawns when she's going into heat, a doe fawn doesn't shun her mother or sibling. She's still hanging out with her maternal group, following her elders wherever they go. Meanwhile, the buck would like nothing better than to rob that cradle. There might be only one doe in heat at any given time, but when deer congregate on a good food source, there's no easier place or time for a buck to find a late-season breeder. In my area, this scenario usually unfolds from December 10 to 15. After that, snows usually deepen and temperatures drop further, forcing hunters to focus on food sources. Granted, a 5-day block in a fickle month like December offers only a small window of opportunity. And yes, you might only be dealing with one estrus doe here or there, but almost everything else leans in your favor. Bottom line, you want to be in your tree as much as possible December 10 through 15. If you know where an estrus doe will likely be, the only question remaining is where to hang your tree stands to ambush the bucks she beckons. All right, so second rut. In this case, Tom mentioned he really seems to see that in his area of southwest Wisconsin from December 10 through 15. I've seen it in southern Michigan and southern Ohio from like December 1 through 10. So it's going to be a localized thing. But anywhere in that first half-ish of December, it's something just to keep an eye out. It's something to be aware of. It's something to take advantage of if it happens to pop up in your zone. Now, all that kind of in our back pocket, the biggest thing, the most common thing to be thinking about, the general approach to hunting in December and January it's pretty standard across the board. I've heard about this from Will Brantley. I've heard about this from Don Higgins, from Jeff Sturgis, from Steve Bartilla, from Bill Winke, from Mark Drury to, basically every person down the line. It's relatively simple for most people. I'm going to share with you a couple exceptions, but for most folks, the general approach is, understanding what we just talked about, that deer are looking for safety, that deer are looking for late season food, and that deer are looking for late season cover. Understanding those things, you have to find these smaller concentrations of deer, and then you need to very carefully hunt them when the conditions are right. Because of the fact that, with all of this stuff being true, with all these things being the case, deer are going to be on edge in a way that they were not in the past. Deer are going to be more spooky than they were in the past. Deer are going to be reacting to hunting pressure more aggressively than they have in the past. Because of all that pressure, they just aren't going to be giving you many second chances. So that's why many people take a locate, wait, and then strike approach. They're typically not going to be hunting a spot over and over and over, banging into the very best spots and volume hunting it aggressively like maybe they did in November. This is the time for a wait and see approach. Usually, most people would tell you this is a time generally to observe from afar, to scout carefully, and then to strike when the iron is hot. Strike when that best moment and the best set of conditions allows, because you're probably, in many cases, not going to get a whole lot of second chances. Now, of course, you might have an amazing setup where you have tremendous entry and exit and you can get in and out of the spot without deer knowing you, and maybe you have a perfect place to blow your wind. And if all of those things are true, then maybe you can get away with more hunts. Maybe you can do this more frequently without educating deer, and you don't need to take so much of that wait and see approach. But for most people, it's going to be that kind of thing. So the key things that we need to understand, the key things we need to be looking for are, given there's this limited area for opportunity, concentrated deer areas, and then this limited sets of mistakes that you can make, what are the conditions you're waiting for? I want to talk to you about what are the ideal conditions, and then I want to talk to you about, how do you find where these deer are going to be in a little bit more detail. But first, let's talk conditions and why the right set of conditions can make this a really great time to hunt. We alluded to this earlier, that things are getting tough for deer. But when things get really tough for deer, it can get them on their feet in a more extreme manner than maybe at any other time of year, other than the rut, I suppose. We're talking extreme cold, and we're talking precipitation events or coming off of major precipitation events. So, of course, the colder it gets, the more Arctic tundra type situation you can possibly have, the more these deer are going to want to be up on their feet in daylight, as Bartilla mentioned, because it's warmer and more comfortable for them to do so. And then they can bed during those coldest times and just hold it out and just try to conserve energy. So these deer, if it's very cold, they're going to be on their feet earlier and trying to consume as much resources as they possibly can. They got to refuel the tank. They're constantly consuming calories to try to stay alive and stay warm. So if you have that big cold front, that mega cold front, the single digit temperatures or something like that, that can be a very, very good time to hunt. And then also precipitation. If you get a big blizzard moving through, if you have a bunch of snow on the ground that covers up the typically easier to access food, again, you've got something that will probably get deer moving on their feet a little bit more, move a little bit further, stay out there a little bit longer. That big old buck might come out to the field edge sooner. All of that is a good thing for you. So those are two things maybe that will be particularly helpful for you when you're trying to choose when to make your move, when to go hunt that good spot, when to take your out-of-state trip, whatever it is. A big storm passing through and finally calming down on the backside, that's another good. Maybe even without big snow, that's still a pretty great time of year. Let's say you had a warm spell. It was in the 40s, let's say. Big cold front moves through with like 40-mile-an-hour winds or 30-mile-an-hour winds and rain and sleet and nasty stuff, and that lasts for several days. If that's the case, that's probably going to put deer down a little bit. When that passes through and all of a sudden it's 20 degrees colder, blue skies, high barometric pressure, and winds have died down to 8-10 miles an hour, when that nasty thing kind of moves through all of a sudden, now those deer are going to be, all right, I got to get the food back on because I just had to, take a day off or a day and a half of maybe the higher feeding that they wanted to do. They weren't able to do that comfortably. So now all of a sudden you have that increased feeding activity as well. Looking for those things, it's not too terribly different than what we talked about in October when we were hoping for these same fronts, but now it can be more extreme. And really the more extreme activity you're going to see. Maybe a cold front in October might have gotten deer moving 10, 15 minutes earlier in the evening, let's say. A extreme cold front or 12 inches of snow or something like that in December, that might get a mature buck on its feet 2 hours before daylight if you're in a place where they feel safe. That's really always the qualifier. Everything we're talking about is typically only true if they feel safe in these places. If they don't feel safe in a zone, they're just not going to be there. And if they kind of feel moderately safe in the place, they're probably not going to move in daylight at all. If they feel relatively safe, if they feel pretty comfortable, if you found that true sanctuary, that true pocket, that's when you can then see these deer moving in daylight when these circumstances, when these cold fronts or snowstorms or whatever pass through. So that's what we're looking for. I want to share with you Don Higgins' take on this. He describes why, because of these conditions, because of these things I just described, why this can be such a good time of year to hunt, why this can be, in his opinion, one of the best possible times to kill a mature buck. So here's what Don has to say.
Well, it's ironic. When I wrote my first book 10 years ago, after I'd shot that buck, the 214-inch buck we was just talking about, a short time later, I wrote my first book. And when I talk about the late season in that first book, I kind of downplayed it as one of the worst times of the season to shoot a mature buck. But in the years that have passed, I've totally changed my mind 180 degrees. Now I believe that the late season is the very best time of the year to kill a mature buck on purpose. But the key is you've got to have a good food source, and you've got to have an undisturbed bedding location. If you got those two together, and then you've got it made, because there's very likely to be a mature buck there. And then you just got to wait it's about timing. You need the worst weather possible. The worse the weather gets, the better your odds. So, I've got a couple different farms that I manage and where I'm allowed to plant food plots and things like that. And on both those farms, I've got my stands in place. I got the food plots in place. I've stayed out of the bedding cover all fall, and I'm just waiting. I'm just biding my time, waiting on the perfect opportunity. And whenever the temperature, gets down around 0 at night or single digits during the day as a high, when it does that for a few days, you can count on the bucks, on every deer in the woods, really. It doesn't matter if he's a mature buck or yearling buck or a doe. Under those conditions, they're going to be on their feet in the afternoon headed to that food, and they're more than likely going to get there way before dark. And, I kind of set the table throughout the entire year by planting those food plots, by staying out of those bedding areas. But then when the time's right, I get into those stands, and you can kill, the biggest buck in the woods on purpose year after year after year that way.
All right. And to give you I'm going to give you a couple different thoughts here. Here's another take from Steve Bartilla. And what he's going to share here is why all of this can lead to good hunting and stuff that you can take advantage of as a deer hunter. So now that we understand how whitetails cope with winter stress, we can explore how to most efficiently use these traits to our advantage. At first glance, it may appear that drastically reduced movement is a disadvantage. However, finding where a mature buck resides swiftly transforms this into a significant advantage. Investing several late afternoons observing the listed food sources is a good way to find him, because there's no other time during the season that a mature buck more rigidly clings to a pattern. This is well worth the effort. With that accomplished, the next step is to backtrack his trail just far enough into the woods to allow the hunter a route to and from the stand. On the rare occasion when a safe route exists to a field edge stand, such as in the hunt that began this chapter, this is also acceptable. In fact, it's preferred, owing to the increased odds of catching the minimal second route activity that might occur. This also provides a firearms hunter with the chance of a longer shot. Moreover, because the concentration effect often means that more than one mature buck is using the same food source, sitting the edge often provides opportunities that in-woods trails don't. Still, without a good route, more harm than good is the most common result. The deer's tendency to shift feeding times up is also an advantage. Frankly, deep snows and cold temps are the late-season hunter's best friends. The worse it gets, the more inspiration the bruiser has to hit the food source before dark. This is so pronounced that these conditions can make an otherwise nearly exclusively nocturnal buck feed during daylight in an open field. Many of my best hunts have occurred on the coldest day of the season. On the flip side, unseasonably mild conditions tend to shut down a mature buck's daylight movement. If a high-risk stand site is the only option, saving it for an afternoon of brutally low temperatures is the best option. All right, so to give us one more perspective on this and kind of shifting gears a little bit, I want to talk through this next stage, which is, we've kind of explored why late season hunting can be so good. If you're able to find these pockets, if you're able to find where these deer feel safe, if you can find the quality food and the quality thermal cover, that is a big set of qualifiers. That last part especially, finding that quality food, finding that quality bedding, finding where these deer want to be. And I want to share with you John Eberhardt's approach to that, as well as several others, because this is pretty key to the whole topic, right? Safety first, then food and bedding. And so John Eberhardt is somebody who, different than Don Higgins or Steve Bartilla or Tom Ingerbo, he's typically not hunting land he owns or manages. He's hunting public land or knock-on-door permission stuff. And so he has a very, different perspective on the late season than these guys in that, in some spots like Michigan, he won't hunt the late season there hardly at all because he simply doesn't have access to these safe places. So what he does instead is he packs up and travels to a lower pressure state where he can find these pockets. And then he takes advantage of some of the same things that Don and Steve mentioned. So here's John on his late season approach, how he finds deer in these situations. The most consistently productive method of hunting during the late season is to concentrate your efforts on hunting transition corridors between known bedding areas and feeding locations, such as mast or fruit trees that still have food in the ground, or crop fields if in an agricultural area. These are also the same areas where does will be, so they double as searching areas for late estrus does as well. Just as during any other time of the season, the transition corridor between bedding and feeding must have adequate security cover for a mature buck to feel comfortable transitioning through during daylight hours. When there are several inches or more snow on the ground, locust trees that dropped bean pods and cedars become major feeding areas, and the deeper the snow, the greater the odds of a mature buck encounter. In large cedar swamps, hunting at any time of day can be productive because these swamps become deer bedding areas and winter deer yards. Prior to snow, there are other more preferred and accessible mast and vegetation than cedar boughs and locust beans, but when there's deep snow, cedar boughs are an easily accessible food source, and one paw scrape of the ground under a locust tree will uncover several bean pods. The colder it is, the greater the need is for deer to feed. We have found in pressured areas that to some extent, the more severe the weather conditions, the better mature bucks move during daylight. This is likely because while growing up, they have had less encounters with hunters during foul weather conditions. General deer activity might be less than normal, but mature buck activity will spike during many inclement weather conditions. All right, let's continue down this line of thinking. How to kind of focus in on the best late season food sources. I want to share with you some of this from Mark and Terry Drury in their book, Giant Whitetails, A Lifetime of Lessons. This is an old school book, but there's a nice simple excerpt here in which they explain their take on late season food, on finding the spots to focus for deer at this time of year. Our plantings for late season hunting are based around 3 different food sources. The 2 most important are corn and soybeans, with beans probably being number 1. Deer prefer the beans to anything else in December, particularly when it's snowy and seasonably cold. Not every December is created equal. From region to region and year to year, you don't always have those cold temperatures and heavy snowfalls. When that's the case, deer hardly hit the beans at all. That's why we also plant some green food sources, like, they give you some examples here: winter wheat, buck forage oats, biologic cover, maximum, yada yada. When the first ponds, creeks, and puddles freeze over in early December, there's little natural green forage around, even though there might not be any snow cover. Green plants attract deer and provide them with a good source of moisture. Over the past few years, we've discovered the water content of green plants can be a huge drawing card for whitetails in December. In short, we plant beans and corn predominantly, probably 80% on the farms we hunt late in the season. However, we don't turn a blind eye towards green food, which comprises about 20% of our plantings. A major point I need to make is we see more mature bucks in December and January than we do in October and November. During the rut, big deer burn a lot of fuel and eventually run out of gas. In December, staring down the barrel of a long, tough winter, they go back to filling the station and hammer high-energy foods like beans and corn. We take advantage of that weakness. Whitetails truly are slaves to their stomachs, and it's never more obvious than in December. What's more, if you put out enough seed and plant it right, you'll not only see most of the deer that live on your farm, you will also draw bucks from all around. Late in the season, when all the natural forage is gone and gun pressure hits adjoining lands, your land suddenly becomes a safe haven. The big deer come there for one reason: food. The colder and snowier it is in December, the more whopper bucks you'll see. Terry and I will take 2 inches of snow, but we prefer 5 or 6 inches, which thoroughly covers all the leftover acorns and other woodland foodstuffs. That causes deer to pour into our fields. Deer movement is usually magical ahead of, during, and after a fresh snowfall. Here in the Midwest, Terry and I prefer daytime highs not to exceed 20 or 25 degrees. When you have 40 or 50 degree temps, late season hunting is not nearly as good. The more threatening the conditions, with snow and highs in the teens and 20s, the better your chances because more deer get on their feet and move towards food sources. Finally, I ought to mention that whitetails prefer cut fields as opposed to standing crops. When you or a farmer harvests a field, all the residue, be it beans or corn, sits on the ground, absorbs a little moisture, softens up, and often becomes more palatable to deer. Also, it's much easier for does and bucks to move and feed in a low-cut field of corn or beans. All right, there is the Drury take on their key food sources and why that works for them so well. Moving on to another set of ideas here, I want to get Jeff Sturgis's thoughts on this as he breaks down some of the key food sources and habitats that he looks for both on public land and on private land.
So even going back to Pennsylvania and that public land, I don't want to be out in the big open hardwoods unless I have some indication that there's still acorns and that's where they're feeding, tore up ground, snow. I really want to be in the high stem count areas where you have lots of regeneration, lots of habitat coming in. Think upland cover if you can find it on public land. It's hard, but where you have shrubs, bushes, briars, hardwood regen, maybe on the edge of a swamp. It's all coming together where there's a lot of different habitat groups coming in together. That means there's a lot of browse. And to me, as opposed to a wide open oak flat where deer have been pressured, hunters have been out to, they might feed there more at night. It's safe, it's social. They can see predators for a long distance. I'd rather be tucked up against that high stem count, diversity and browse on public land. And then when you go on to private, if you're managing your own property, you want to definitely have a lot of younger timber coming in and diversity of habitat. But then you're looking at either high volume greens like brassica, if it's towards the north, or corn, beans that are standing late, if you can get that. And then adjacent to that same type of cover where you have really thick cover. So if I'm hunting in the morning, I want to be by that thick cover, high stem count, and then I might flip stands and go hunt a more food source stand related for the afternoon on private land. But on public land, that might be all in the same. It might be you're hunting on the edge of a very thick area that deer might transfer out of to go to an open food source like a big oak flat during the afternoon.
If you had to rank order late season food sources from what your very best would be down the list, how would you do that? Because I'm imagining, I've been in this situation where I've hunted ag country and I've got some green food plots, and then there's a neighboring cornfield, and then there's another field next to that that's beans, and then there's some cuttings on the neighbors, and I know there's some thick natural browse in there, and I'm trying to think, where should I hunt tonight? And I've got all these different food sources to choose from, and I'm trying to think, okay, what's going to be the absolute most attractive for this time of the year? If you have the luxury of that situation, how would you rank order what would potentially be most attractive? And then as a follow-up, and I'm making this even more tricky, but as a follow-up, would conditions change that order? So like if I told you it was a 40-degree December day versus a 10-degree December day, how would you reorder things as well?
And kind of to back up just a little bit, like you mentioned, you have all these available. What choice would you make? But a lot of times, especially if people are building it or planting it on private land, you're not looking at what's the best. You're looking at what's the best that would be available. And so a lot of times someone could say 10 degrees, late December, standing beans, pretty hard to beat. 40 degrees, late December, standing beans, I'd rather shift to corn or greens. But then at the same time, even beans, that 10 degrees late December, someone has to have either fences or a large amount of acreage of beans to make them last till that time. So I see people beat themselves. Like, I love beans late like that, but if they're not there, then it doesn't really matter what your scale 1 to 10 would be. And then also, you have to look at what's the most unpressured. So let's say just someone could say, okay, mid-December hunt. Let's just say December 12th, there's a little bit of the rut left in upper Midwest, upper third of the country. And you have a choice of a bean field and a corn field, but the bean field's been pressured and hunted heavily, then I'm going to go pick the corn. And you might even find there's a lot of does and fawns in the bean field because they can take a lot more hunting pressure, human pressure. I'd rather cheat over towards that corn or the brassica that deer are still coming to, and there's still does coming to it, obviously. If does aren't going to it, why would a buck? I mean, he wants to eat some good food too. But unpressured should be the first the first requirement of a late season food source, and then you start looking at what's best. And if it's 40 degrees, it seems like they really like greens. If it's warmer, if they have high volume greens, even if they have standing wheat or rye mixed with various greens, clover down in Kentucky, West Virginia, Southern Illinois, Southern Indiana, where you might even get a little growth of clover in November because it hit 67 degrees a few days. And so that's a little bit different too versus something you might want to do in Central Michigan or focus on. So heavy greens of some kind when it's a little warmer later, and then certainly those grains. But again, it has to be unpressured.
All right. So I think, something worth mentioning here, something that's very important is in identifying these places, right? Identifying, I guess everything. Trying to find where these safe places are for deer. Trying to find where these best late season food sources are. Trying to find these pockets of bedding cover that's still available. You have to do some scouting to figure that out. Now, hopefully, in a best case scenario, you have been, doing this for years in a particular area, and from history where these key late season hangouts are. But if you're not, or if you are still trying to figure it out as you go, you are going to have to do some scouting. Now, there's, the same forms of scouting as we talked about in October, they apply now in December. You simply have to do it with an even greater degree of concern and care because, as mentioned, these deer are very touchy. These deer have been pressured, they have been hunted, they have been harassed. They're not going to tolerate much. So on the ground scouting, if you have to do it, you've got to be very tactical about when you do it and how you do it because these deer, they could blow out from a long ways away. I think a very important thing to be thinking about, a special consideration this time of year is how open the habitat is, right? Where maybe you could have walked through a forest and nothing could see you unless they were within 30 yards of you. Now it might be 200 yards away. They can see you. So when you're scouting, be aware of that. And I would suggest, I think many other people would suggest taking a much lighter touch when it comes to on the ground scouting. This is when long distance observation is huge. Driving back roads and looking at these fields, getting up on a hill and watching from afar in a place that you're not going to spook a bunch of deer, but you can see into an important area. Of course, trail cameras play a part in this as well. Going out there midday once on your bike or your truck or your UTV and moving cameras to late season food sources in places that you think they might be using, and then using those trail cameras to confirm for you which is the hot food source at the moment. All of that can be really helpful. But using a light touch, I can't emphasize that enough. I can't tell you how many different people have kind of mentioned this over and over and over again. In the late season, you have to like wear white satin gloves. You have to be so careful This is like a very fragile situation you're dealing with. If you happen to be so lucky to have that sanctuary where deer have felt safe, and if you are so lucky to have quality late season food and to have that quality late season bedding cover, if you have this special thing that many people don't have, you have a gift. You have a fragile, fragile gift, and you do not want to waste that and throw it away because you're not being careful. So, that all said, sometimes you do still need to get on the ground and scout things out in person. John Eberhart advocates for that sometimes. I want to read for you another excerpt from his book, The Ultimate Guide to DIY Bucks, as he discusses a couple quick things when it comes to scouting in the late season. He says, if you need to scout, if there's snow in the forecast, we recommend waiting until it falls and then scout 24 hours after it has quit snowing. By late season, routines are somewhat consistent from bedding to preferred feeding areas. And if you scout an area 24 hours after a fresh snow, you will be able to identify exactly where the deer are bedding by the freshly used runways leading to them and where they are feeding by the kicked up snow to access the food on the ground. The point is that a day or so after a fresh snow, you know exactly where the deer are feeding, and while it's not advised to intrude into their bedding areas during late season, you can backtrack to see the area they're bedding in. You'll also be able to decipher if the transition corridor has adequate security cover for mature buck movements during daylight. In short, if you wait for this fresh snow, you can take one big swing with your scouting, which will make an impact. But if you do it just once with this specific set of circumstances, you can learn a ton in one trip and then use that hopefully for the next week or 2 or 3 or whatever it is you need. So something to keep in mind there. Now, something we've alluded to, which I haven't given you a whole lot of detail, is what makes for late season bedding cover, what makes for that security cover, thermal cover the deer like. I shared a little bit. I want Don Higgins to give you just a little bit more insight. So here's an excerpt from a previous podcast I did with Don as he discusses late season cover.
Well, it's extremely thick. It's also got some thermal cover, cedars, pines, a lot of the oak species. Well, not a lot of them, but some oak species will hold their leaves in the winter. Pin oaks, sawtooth oak, shingle oaks. Those species will hold their leaves all winter long and provide, some wind and thermal cover for the deer. But the main thing is you want it thick, but you want it free of human intrusion. And that goes for the entire year. You don't want to be stomping in your late season bedding area in October and ruin it months before you're planning to hunt it. That freedom of human intrusion is probably the most important thing, even more so than the type of plants and the lay of the terrain and everything. I like to say that every mature buck has a sanctuary, and if he didn't, he'd have never made it to mature status. He'd have been killed before that. And the thing about sanctuaries is you can create them or you can find them. Now, on the properties that we have control over, the best thing to do is go out and create them, because you can make the best cover possible. You can control the human intrusion within that area and everything else, and you can make an excellent sanctuary. But sometimes that's not possible. Like you mentioned, other hunters have access to the property or whatever. Well, then you let the deer find the sanctuary and create it. Well, he doesn't really create it, but he just finds those pockets, where the human intrusion is not there, where he feels safe. And you can either create it or you can find it, and the buck's going to be there either way.
All right. So we have discussed the importance of security. We've discussed how to identify quality late season food sources and what some of those are. We have now discussed the bedding and cover needs that deer have during the late season. I want to tie a bow a little bit on this general approach to hunting whitetails in the late season, which is the find them, learn them, wait until the right conditions, and then strike kind of approach. I want to talk through just a couple special considerations when trying to execute those hunts, or when, anytime you're in the woods. I alluded to this first one a second ago when I talked about how the cover has changed, the habitat has changed in the woods. What used to be a spot where maybe you would only be seen from 30 yards away, maybe now you're seen from 200 yards away. This also applies not just to scouting, but to hunting. The woods are open. The grassy fields are knocked down by snow or cold weather. Everything is more open. So when you go in to hunt, maybe an afternoon hunt or whatever it is, you can be seen from much further away. This is even more so if there's snow on the ground and you just kind of stand out as this big dark silhouette against a perfectly white background. So access and entry or being up in the tree, all of that is so much more difficult. You really need to think about cover. Visual cover is very, very important for late season hunts. So walking in, really be aware of what kind of cover you can take advantage of to sneak in without deer seeing you. When you choose a tree to hunt from, really be thinking about what's the cover up in the tree. Without leaves up there, are you still hidden? Or do you stand out as this huge object in a little tiny beanpole tree? That can really impact the success of your hunt. Another thing to think about here is sound. Sound travels so much further in the late season. For one thing, all of the leaves are down, the grass is down, as we just mentioned. That just allows for sound to travel further. I feel like for whatever reason, everything just seems to like echo more. I can't say this with 100% certainty, but it just seems like in the late season, I've had many more hunts where the wind is kind of down, and it just seems like any little thing will just be heard from a mile away. Every piece of metal seems to make more noise, like your ladder steps, your tree stand. It just seems like things want to creak and pop and just cause trouble. So you need to be aware of that. You need to be extra careful to stay quiet. If there's anything you can do ahead of a hunt to dampen sound, to tape things up a little bit better, do that because sound can really get you in trouble at this time of year. Again, deer are very averse to hunters right now. So any little extra sound, any little extra sight of movement, those things can really be a big problem. All of that brings us to making decisions about when to hunt. We've talked earlier about, waiting for the right conditions, right? Waiting for that cold front, waiting for that precipitation, waiting for that, dire Arctic tundra event. That's what a lot of these people do, right? Because they find where this little special pocket of deer is, and they don't want to go and hunt it over and over and over again and educate these deer, right? So instead, they wait for the right conditions. They wait for that cold front or for that, snowstorm, and then they go take their big strike, and they do it very, very carefully. For many deer hunters, this also means evening hunts. Morning hunts are more difficult to pull off at this time of year for all the reasons we just discussed, right? Deer are traveling back to their bedrooms in the morning. They might already be back there early. If you are trudging through the woods when it's very loud out and it's wide open out, and maybe you're crunching through ice or snow, it's just very risky to get there without educating deer. And you simply can't get away with educating deer now as much as you maybe could have in October or definitely in November. So because of that, a lot of folks prefer just to hunt the evenings. They have to be smart about how they get out after the hunt, but getting in, where deer are, right? They're in their bedroom. So you can walk in being confident that as long as you avoid wherever that core bedding area is, and as long as you're smart about where your wind's blowing, you should be able to get in there safely and have a good hunt. All that said, morning hunts, of course, there's never, never say never. Things are never black and white. There are certainly people who hunt mornings in the late season. I know Jeff Sturgis is one. I know my buddy Tony Peterson is one. I know there's plenty of others. You just have to be very careful about how you do this. So I want to play for you an excerpt from a video that we produced for Wired to Hunt. Tony talking through his take on hunting late season mornings.
When you're talking about late season bow hunting, we kind of default back to a mindset that we have during September and early October where they say, don't hunt the mornings. There's no way to get in. All you do is damage your spots. Anyone who knows me knows that I think that's total bunk. I look at it almost exactly the same way I look at it early season. There's probably a way to figure out a spot to have really good morning hunts, but you got to think about a couple different things. Where do I go to catch them staging, or how do I get close to their bedding? You're probably not going to get in on a food source in the morning and be able to hunt it very well. You're going to blow everything out of there. You don't want to do that. So you want to think, okay, well, I know they feed in this field. Where do they go back to bed? How do they travel? How do they get there? The main part of finding a spot to bow hunt a late season deer in the morning is all about your access. You got to figure out a way to drop in there. You got to figure out a way to use a creek. You got to figure out some way to come in from a direction where you're not gonna alert the deer. And then you're talking more open woods than you've had all season. You're talking deer that are cagey after the gun season, after a bunch of weeks of bow hunting. You're talking about deer that are not gonna put up with a bunch of mistakes. So your access is really important. With any access, you're thinking about the wind, of course, But late season, you're also really thinking about the sounds you make. It might be dead calm. You might have a little frost. You might have a little snow, a little ice. You might have just frozen leaves. You know, how far away can you park so they don't go, oh, there's a truck parked right up here. Now I heard him get out. Now I hear him walking through the woods. You got to think about how good their hearing is and how calm the conditions are. Really pay attention to the forecast. If it's going to be dead calm, I'm probably not going to hunt. Even if I just summon my inner ninja and I'm sneaking through there really well, I'm going to make more noise than I want. Am I going to get a little bit of rain? Am I going to get a little bit of wind like I have here right now? Am I going to get something to help me out to utilize that spot? Don't give up on mornings in the late season if you have a chance to hunt. It just takes a little detective work to make sure you have that situation and you know how to hunt it.
All right. There's Tony's take on the morning hunts in the late season. I want to circle back to this kind of wait and see approach one last time and explore what to do if you don't get that weather. Because for many people, the late season is find them, wait, strike when it's right. But what happens if you wait, and you never get the right moment? What if you never get that big cold front? What if you never get that big snowstorm? Here's what Don Higgins does. Here's his thoughts on what to do when you don't get the cold weather that you want during the late season.
Well, I don't hunt very often, that's for sure, because I'm hunting the biggest bucks I can find. And a lot of times that means that I'm not looking at things from just a one season perspective. I'm looking to kill that deer. And if it happens this season, great. But I don't want to go in and tip him off when the conditions aren't right. Next year, he could be 20 inches bigger. And if you've educated him, you've just made him, 3 times as hard to kill. So a lot of times, if the weather isn't perfect, I'll hunt secondary locations. I will stay out of my prime locations. And, I might watch a feeding area from a distance just to see if there happens to be a buck coming out before dark and one that I'd want to target, which is very, very rare for that to happen. But I'm not one just to sit home either. I've got to be out there doing something. So I just as soon sit back and watch from a distance and see if maybe there's a buck coming out that I wouldn't expect, under those conditions. But, mature bucks are unpredictable.
All right, and I would just add to that, you always have to think about timing available, right? And the implications of, how you might educate deer. So if you are waiting for the right moment, but you never get it, and then you just don't hunt that deer at all, well, then you had 0% chance to kill a deer anyways. The whole idea here is that you're trying to not hunt so much on days when your odds were low that it impacts your chances someday later when the odds are high. But if you never get that someday later, what was the point of avoiding all of those lesser hunts? In the end, you have to eventually hunt. You have to get out there and try. So it's just a matter of finding the best available. So maybe the best available is not the mega cold front. Maybe the best available is like, hey, all I have left is this week or these next 2 weeks, and I'm not going to get that front, but I do have 4 or 5 days here this coming weekend when it's like, okay, it's not great, but it's not horribly warm. That's when you go then. You just look for what's your best chance. What are your lowest odds for this being a swing and a miss? And then go take your chances. And I think maybe Jeff alluded to this or someone did earlier, but if you can set yourself up in such a place that the odds of educating deer are really low, if you have that amazing access, if you have that smart exit plan, if you can sit in a place that you've got a very safe place for your wind to blow, if you can do that, then you might have a situation where you can hunt over and over and over again. I know that Jeff Sturgis has talked about doing this in gun season. He sets up in late season locations for gun hunts quite a bit away from where the deer are going to come out, quite a bit away from that best stuff, just within gun range, so that he can actually hunt a larger number of days in the late season and give kind of the roll of the dice enough rolls for that big buck to finally show up. So not just hunting the single best weather day, but instead maybe hunting 7 of those days when some of those days are great, some of those days are okay, but you're giving yourself a chance to be there when the magic finally happens. But that only can work if you have that really, really safe, bulletproof location that's well prepared, that's well planned out, that's not going to get you burned over and over and over again. Because if you get burned several times, these deer are going to catch on very quicker than at any other time of the year, and you're simply not going to get any more chances. So that's kind of the key thing to be thinking about this time of year. Now, not everybody has this situation. Not everybody is going to have some private land where they could build a sanctuary or plant food plots and have crops up for deer. Not everyone is going to have a lease where there's limited pressure. There's going to be some folks out there. I've been in this boat. My buddy Tony's been in this boat. I know many of you have been in this boat where you just don't have that. And then you're just searching and hoping to find a gem out there. And that doesn't mean it's going to be impossible. That doesn't mean that you can't have late season success during, or on public land or on by permission stuff. You definitely can. It just requires a little bit more work and trying to find these things out in the real world. So I want to play for you a couple more quick takes from Tony as he breaks down, number one, why hunting public land in the late season isn't as bad always as some people think. And then finally, what to do when you don't have one of these dynamite built-in food sources that we've been talking about so much. So 2 quick takes here from Tony on public land and hunting in the areas that aren't, carefully managed and manicured for late season.
Probably 99.7% of the late season bow hunting advice has come from people who have awesome properties to hunt. If you're a public land hunter, it might make you feel like you don't really have a chance in the late season. A lot of people just won't do it. But I'm here to tell you some of the best late season hunting I've found in my life has been on public land. I usually do sort of a quick turn and burn scouting trip. I just want to find fresh tracks. I want to find those trails that are pounded. I'm not looking for big buck sign right now. I just want to see evidence that deer are living there. The second thing you got to think about with this is what's going on out there right now. We always kind of think that public land is worse than private land, but there are a lot of areas where some of the best wintering cover is on public land because it can't be farmed. Even though those properties might be okay for most of the season, they really become something special when the deer opportunities are so limited to get into good cover to survive in. And so in some ways, public land can be even better than you would expect in the late season. One thing that I know about public land in the late season is everybody's thinking the same thing. This is gonna suck. This is not gonna be fun to hunt. I don't wanna go do it when I know all the deer have been blown out of there or shot out of there. I've found that I can have so many of these places almost to myself. It's almost like having your own private spot to hunt. At least 95% of the hunters have given up. That's a big advantage. If you're sitting there and you're looking at the clock kind of wind down on your hunting season and you only have public land or you might want to go check out some public land, do it. Like you can have amazing late season bow hunts if you go in with the right mindset and you spend a little time trying to find those deer concentrations. The traditional late season hunting advice is to find that food source, sit on it, and wait for the deer to come out. Most people don't have that. And not every food source is created equal. When you're thinking about a late season bow hunt and you don't have that perfect food source, it doesn't mean you're out of the game. Deer still have to walk from the food to their bedding areas. They're still gonna mill around. They still might browse. There's still a lot of opportunities. You might be hunting thousands of acres of timber and not have a destination food source within 3 miles of you. Does that mean you're out of the game? Absolutely not. The first thing you gotta do is you gotta analyze your situation. What do you have to work with? Do you have access to a property that they might be bedding in? Do you have access to a transitional property? If you're in that big wood situation, do you have some mast they might be on? Do you have some browse they might be on? A lot of times with hunting, we kind of focus on the negatives. What are the positives? Like, what are you working with? The second thing you gotta do is figure out where deer like to walk. When I'm sitting there and I don't have that destination food source for whatever reason, I kind of go back to this mobile strategy of observe, move, observe, move. Those deer in the late season, even if they've been really pressured, they'll start to mill around, they'll browse, they'll stage, they'll stay in the cover. But if you've got good binos and you got a good vantage point, you'll probably pick them up. I know these deer have to walk to get to food. I know they have to walk to get to where they're gonna bed. Maybe in the right situation, they're gonna have to walk somewhere to get water, depending on where you hunt. If you're down south, they're gonna give you something to work with. But you gotta go in with the idea that the food source stuff, that's for the people who have 1,000 acres in southern Iowa to manage. You don't have that. And so you can get into the woods, start watching them. they'll give you something to work with. Then the next step is to figure out how to get in on them a little bit closer. The other thing that you can do here, and I do this a lot in the late season, is I start running cameras a lot more. I'll mount them high up in a tree with a camera mount, angle them down on trails, and I can couple that with what I actually observe when I'm in there and I play it safe, and you can start to pin down where those deer are killable when they're not on that food source that you can't hunt or that you don't have. And so don't give up on your late season hunts if you don't have that food source. Figure out a way to get dialed into the current deer movement, then work your way in for the right setup. This can totally be accomplished if you're really careful about it. You will get on those deer and you will be successful just by figuring out where they like to walk.
All right, now I want to share one final alternative set of ideas for the late season, because I think much of what we talked here is kind of your standard late season, December, January hunting style, right? You don't have to do it this way. There is another way that I have dabbled in, I have tried, I've learned from some folks on, and is very fun, very interesting, and very compelling if you have the right set of circumstances. And that is tracking deer in the snow. Tracking deer in the snow. Typically, this is something done in the big woods. This is, Maine is famous for this. I know people do this in northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, northern Michigan. I know people can do this in Pennsylvania, but really anywhere you have snow and some space to roam, some space to follow deer. So if you have some either big parcels of land you own or public land that stretches a decent bit, if you have snow, you can follow deer tracks in the snow during gun season. If you have that late firearm season, or maybe your gun season doesn't open until December, and you can actually follow deer right to where they are and get a shot at them. Or, some of the things from Hale, I'm going to share with you some excerpts from Hale Blood, who's kind of the modern day OG when it comes to tracking deer in the snow. There are things you can learn from tracking deer in the snow that even if you are bow hunting, you can use that to your advantage to set up in some of the ways we talked about. So you can go in and let's say you just don't know where these deer are right now. You have not found a pocket. You don't have that amazing spot like we've talked about. But maybe you can backtrack a deer in the snow and find where they're moving, find where they're bedding, find where they're heading to feed. And yeah, you just made this aggressive scouting move today that's probably going to blow things up. But again, back to John Eberhardt's take a couple minutes ago, maybe doing that just once, you can learn enough to then make some smart hunts later in the late season. All that said, I mentioned Hale Blood. Hale Blood is the author of a number of books. He's done a lot of films. He's an outfitter up in Maine, a tremendous deer hunter and deer tracker. I had the great privilege of getting to spend some time with him a few years ago and actually get to go to his camp and go out in the woods with him and have him teach me how he did this. And I got to watch him for a full 24 hours, not full 24, but a full day of hunting to see exactly how he tracks deer and kind of learn his style and approach to that. So what I want to do here is play for you a quick kind of overview of some of Hal's high-level thoughts on tracking deer in the snow. This is a short video that we produced when I was there visiting with him. And then I'm going to kind of give you a very short rundown of some of the key lessons I learned from him. And then I would suggest, if any of this is interesting to you, to go and listen to the 2 full podcasts that I did with him on this topic, or check out the episode that I filmed with him of our show called Deer Country. So just in advance, I'll tell you, podcast episode 203 and episode 497 are the ones that you want to listen to if the idea of tracking deer in the snow is something you want to learn more about. But first, a really quick rundown of Hal of 3 of his best pieces of advice for people trying to learn to track deer in the snow.
I'm Hal Blood, and these are the 3 things that I think are the most important tips for tracking whitetail bucks. First thing is you got to keep moving. I've had days I've gone all day and not even pick up the big track I want. Got to be willing to walk. Maybe it's 10 miles a day, whatever it is. If you're not willing to do that, you're probably not going to be a tracker. You got to pick up that track. The goal is to catch up to the buck, get where you can jump them, see them, shoot them, whatever it is. The quicker you can do that, the more time you have in the day to hunt for that buck. Second tip, if you jump the buck, wait a half an hour. Sit down, have a sandwich, do whatever you want, but wait a half an hour, let him settle down. If you go right after him, he thinks something's chasing him, and you're going to run after him all day. If you wait a half an hour, he might lay down again. He might keep on his circuit, go check does, do whatever he's doing in life, that's the best time to kill a buck. The third tip would be get in the mindset of the buck. Right from the beginning, when I first get on the buck, I'm trying to figure out what he's up to, what he's doing, what's going on in his life. It's written in the snow for me. I got to interpret it and react to it. He might have some little quirk, idiosyncrasy that tells you he's going to do a certain thing before he lays down. A lot of times it's feeding, but sometimes it's other things. Try to learn that buck, and as you're learning the buck, get that track. You imprint the track size and shape and how his feet may drag in the snow. You internalize that in your memory, and then when you get into other tracks, you should always remember which one is your buck that you're on. It'll make it easier for you.
Okay, so good stuff there from Hale. I'm going to walk you through at a very high level the key things that I learned when I walked out there with Hale, walked in his footsteps, and tried to learn how to track deer. Number one was this idea of speed and needing to cover a lot of ground because you simply have to find a buck track. And once you find a buck track, then you're in the hunt. Then you're actually doing the thing. But because of that, there's two things that he does a ton of. Drives a lot of roads, drives a lot of backcountry, forest roads, dirt roads, two tracks, anywhere he might be able to cut a track and find a relatively fresh track in the snow. He's doing that. Or, and I think he prefers this, actually goes off in the woods and walks loops, walks areas that he knows historically have been good for deer movement, kind of walks through funnels or deer concentrating topography where there's a good chance that a buck might have cruised through, covers lots and lots of ground till he finds that track. He is looking for, and I'm going to read you an excerpt of how he thinks about tracks, but he's looking for a big track that indicates to him it's a mature buck, and then he's looking for a relatively fresh track. Best case is that he wants to find a track from the night before. So he's out there looking for a track that happened in the dark the previous evening or early that morning. What that looks like for him, the thing that stuck with me is that he's looking for a crispy track. So he's looking for the edges of this track still having crisp, sharp lines and edges to them. If you touch it with your fingers, some of the snow might actually still just like kind of fall down. You can just see like a fresh track in the snow. It's really hard to describe with words, but if you were standing out there in the snow and if you took your hand, just like flicked some snow, you would see crisp lines where your fingers went into the snow, but then you would actually see crisp little snowflakes and bunches of snow and stuff scattered on top of the snow. And it's very clearly defined versus an old track where you're going to see very rounded edges. Things just start to deteriorate. They start to round out. It's kind of like they're melting, right? Melting or freezing, but everything gets rounded more. So it's not as crisp. So if you find that very crisp track, that's going to tell you this probably happened the night before. This probably happened sometime relatively recently. In Hale's mind, that was enough to get after. Now here, again, it's fast moving. Once you get on that track, he recommended covering ground fast. You don't need to be too careful. If that deer is on the move in a relatively straight line, you should be in a move fast, covering ground, because he might be, hours and hours and hours ahead of you or miles ahead of you. You've got to catch up. You're looking at two things to slow you down. One, if you see in his movements that he is circling, that he is feeding, that he is zigzagging, that he's heading up into an area of really thick cover, and all of a sudden his straight line turned into this zigzag, slow, circle around, stand around kind of thing, that would be indicative of this deer is getting ready to bed. Then you should slow down. Or if you have a situation where you see that you bumped the deer, then you should slow down. Two different forms of slowing down Hal talked about to me. One would be if you get in there and you see this sign of slowing down and getting ready to bed, but you haven't yet spooked him, this is when he recommends going into what I think he called like the death creep. This is when you really slow down. This is when you are very careful not to make noise, not to make big movements. This is when you're scanning ahead of you and trying to pick apart the terrain and trying to see that little flicker of a tail or that gleam of an antler. You do the death creep to hopefully not spook that deer and hopefully get lucky enough that you happen to see it before it sees you. Then you can pull up and get a shot. In many cases, that doesn't happen, though. You do spook the deer, and you're going to come up and you're going to find a bed, or you're going to find where the deer kicked up and ran off, and you're going to see mud and dirt and snow kicked out behind, and then tracks changing from walking tracks to now bounding tracks. When you see that, another key thing, and Hal mentioned this in that YouTube clip, this is when you take the sandwich break, his kind of famous sandwich break. Take 30 minutes, sit down, relax, give that deer time to run off and slow down and look behind him and not see something coming after him, and then feel safe again and resume what he was going to do. As Hal discussed, if you don't give it that 30-minute break, you're probably just going to push that deer further and further, and he's going to bound and just kind of leave your life. But if you give him that time, he'll slow back down, and you can hopefully catch back up and get that second chance. So those were the key things that I took away from Hal's approach to tracking deer in the snow. Again, this is obviously not comprehensive. Go and listen to episodes 203 and episodes 497 of the Wired to Hunt podcast. Look up my deer country episode in Maine with Hal. There's so much to learn from him and others like him. They've got a podcast. They've got all sorts of great resources. So if you want to learn about tracking deer in the snow, which is a really fun thing to consider in the late season, go and check those out. I've gotten a kick out of it. I want to do more of it in the future. And I think there's something that all of us can learn from when it comes to studying tracks, learning about deer tracks, and really getting to not only follow in their footsteps and try to shoot a deer like that, but also just like learning how to interpret tracks in general. So with that in mind, I do want to read you a little excerpt here from Hal's book, Hunting Big Woods Bucks. He's got a lot here about tracking deer in the snow. I'm just going to pick out a couple little bits here about what he looks for in a track to help him determine if it's one worth following. So he says, when I look at a deer track, there's three things I want to determine: the size of the deer, if it's a buck or a doe, and when the track was made. The first thing I look at is the size and shape of the track itself. Keep in mind that when a deer is walking, the rear foot is placed directly into the front footprint. So the track you see is the rear foot. Keep in mind also that the rear foot is smaller than the front. If the track is 2.5 inches wide and 3 inches long, and the dew claws are 1/2 inch outside of the hooves, it is most likely a mature buck. I personally like tracks that are 3 inches wide, as they are usually made by the old monster bucks. I don't recommend that all hunters hold out for what I call a 3x3 track, as in most places these tracks are few and far between. As I noted earlier, bucks from different areas have different size feet. The sizes that I'm referring to are the northern boreal forest bucks of northern Maine. Make sure you know what's realistic for the size of foot on the bucks in the area you're hunting. The shape of a track can also help you determine whether or not it was made by a mature deer. As a buck gets older, his feet will tend to flatten out. This will cause the dew claws to show more, even in a minimal amount of snow. A mature buck will have dew claws that show 1 to 2 inches behind his hooves, and they'll be noticeably wider than them. A mature buck's toes will often be rounded or blunt in the front from wear of the years. The print of an older buck will appear to be square. This is because as they get older, their feet splay, causing the toes to be spread. This square shape will be apparent no matter how deep the snow may be. The next thing I look at is the length of the stride. I like to see the distance between prints to be 24 to 36 inches. This measurement can vary though, depending on how fast the buck is walking. Generally speaking, the longer a buck's stride is, the longer his body is, which is a good indication of how much the buck might weigh. Long-bodied bucks will typically weigh much more than a short-bodied buck. The other thing I look for is the stagger. This is the distance side to side between the tracks. On a mature buck, this distance will be 8 inches. This measurement is an indication of how wide a buck's body is, and another indication of how much he might weigh. As the buck matures, his body and chest get wider. If you find a track with a 12-inch stagger, you are looking at an old, mossy-horned buck's track. The last thing I look for is that the buck is dragging his feet in the snow. Mature bucks have a tendency to drag their feet, and the older they get, the more they drag them. I call these old bucks cross-country skiers. These bucks drag their feet so much, even in an inch of snow, that is when you see the tracks, it looks like someone was skiing through the woods. I can assure you, I'll never walk past one of those tracks. All right, so much more you can take from Hal in these books or the other resources I mentioned, but hopefully there's something to get you started and intrigued in what you can take from studying the snow. So there is what is hopefully a helpful high-level overview of the late season conditions to expect, how all these things impact deer, the general approach to the learn, wait, and then strike approach to late season hunting, and then a couple alternative ideas to consider as these weeks go on. And I guess I'll leave you just one final thing. And this is similar to what I mentioned in November. And I think it is especially important here at the end of the year, which is remembering what makes this whole thing fun. And the late season is a perfect time to lean into that, because if you're like me, once you get to December or January, you have been grinding at this thing for many, many weeks and months. You're probably exhausted. You've probably been beaten down. You've probably, been on the wrong side of the equation many, many more times than not, right? Even the very best hunters in the world still, they come out on the losing end 99% of the time. So when it comes to this part of the season, it's very easy to be disheartened. It's very easy to want to give up. It's very easy to not enjoy those cold, nasty days out there in the tree. So because of that, my suggestion to you is double down on the things that do bring you joy as a deer hunter. For me, that means taking my kids out more. The late season is when I get my kids, my two sons, out and hunt a lot. This is when I really focus on doe hunts. It's a great time to kill does before the season ends. We've got to do our part as managers. But it's also, when the mature bucks have been seriously, limited in how many are left, all of a sudden you can create a target-rich environment that you wouldn't have had otherwise by setting your sights on does. So it just makes every hunt more exciting and more, raises your expectations for every hunt. It's easier to deal with meat and processing and all that because you've got the colder weather you need. You can hang a deer up and leave it for a while, or you can wait until you get several deer and then process them all at one time. So from that perspective, it's a great time to shoot does. I also highly recommend doing whatever you can to include your family and friends during your late season hunts. This is a great time to not only bring your kids out, but plan a hunt with your dad or your grandpa, or go to the family deer camp, or invite your buddies to your hunting property that usually you just focus on trying to kill a big deer, but maybe now's the time to have everybody over for a big group doe hunt. That's the thing I do every year in the late season, kind of around Christmas or New Year's. It's become a very fun tradition. It's a great way, again, to be a good manager, but also to, just enjoy the camaraderie and the community that hunting builds for us, that sometimes we get a little bit too focused on the deer to take advantage of. So don't do that. Make sure to enjoy these special days here as deer season wraps up with your friends, with your family, with your kids. Get out there, enjoy the heck out of it. We have planned for, dreamed about, obsessed over hunting season for all of these months, and then all of a sudden it came, and then just like that, it's almost done. So soak it up. Really, really squeeze the marrow out of the bone that is these last few weeks of the year. I'm wishing you well. I hope this sets you up for a great last act, for a great final part of the year. Hopefully there's something here that's given you a new idea or inspired you to get out there and try just a little bit more, to bring some friends or to bring your family out, because the late season can be great, and I'm hoping it is for you. So thank you for tuning in. And until next time, stay wired to hunt.